Okay, so I do want to thank Todd and Chander for sharing their papers on Monday so that I would have a little advance notice for thinking about these very complex ideas. And I want to thank Nate also for the chance to wrestle with these two texts, which were so unexpectedly congenial to the project that I call American Humor in Matters of Empire. The project takes a transnational approach to U.S. comic culture to explore how and with what ideological significance the conventions of American humor and comedy have expressed unequal political relationships between the U.S. and other nations. And I began going down this road in the late aughts, studying Connecticut Yankee and also thinking about it in relation to Sam's friendship with Henry Morton Stanley. And so there are some things related to the machine gun that may actually have to do with the fact that Stanley took a Hiram Maxim machine gun with him on a trip that he began to the Congo immediately after hanging out with Sam in Hartford in 1986. This project was the subject of this article and the Quarry Farm Symposium. But what I wanted to do there was to bridge media silos and also to include minority humors in the U.S. whole by sorting American comic types, traditions into three main types of international heritage. And I'll just kind of preview them here so that you know what I'm talking about. One is a tradition of imperial heritage, that is conventions and techniques inherited from England and other European colonial powers in North America. Post-colonial conventions that rejected, reversed, or inverted the inherited ones in order to make them more serviceable for democratic ideology, and vernacular humor is the chief one of these. And then finally, as an outcome of that, the way that vernacular humor, but also minority humors could serve either neo-colonial impulse in incorporating minority humors into American comic culture more broadly, or the obverse, which would be to use the vernacular as a neo-imperialist move to justify U.S. imperialism. So we have colonization then both at home and abroad. So we have the international plots abroad, and then we have the domestic plots that really have to do with internal colonization, settler colonialism of various kinds. So I'm really thrilled that Todd found my Matters of Empire approach productive for his scholarship, and I'm looking forward to the final version of this. But I really want to start here with his visions of imperial war in Irving's Knickerbocker's History of New York. I think it's a really fine down payment on his project. But I want to call your attention and his to the fact that this anti-imperialist allegory of the lunatics in the Knickerbocker's History is actually prefaced a few pages earlier with a passage that argues that the so-called discovery, followed by permanent settlement, farming, and greed, justified European domination in North America and the violence that followed. And I just want to share a little bit of that with you so you get the feeling of it. Oops, here it is. It's been most unquestionably shown that heaven intended the earth should be plowed and sown and manured and laid out in cities and towns and farms and county seats and pleasure grounds and public gardens, all which the Indians knew nothing about. Therefore, they did not improve the talents Providence had bestowed on them. Therefore, they were careless stewards. Therefore, they had no right to the soil, and therefore, they deserved to be exterminated. We can think of this as an early version of the gods Gears and Gods thesis that Nate has offered. It's true the savages might plead that as heaven merely designed the earth to form the abode and satisfy the wants of men, so long as those purposes were answered, the will of heaven was accomplished. But this only proves how undeserving they were of the blessings around them. They were so much the more savages for not having more wants. For knowledge is in some degree an increase of desires, and it is this superiority, both in the number and magnitude of his desires, that distinguishes the man from the beast. Therefore, the Indians, in not having more wants, were very unreasonable animals, and it was but just that they should make way for the Europeans, who had 1,000 wants to their one, and therefore would turn the earth to more account, and by cultivating it, more truly fulfill the will of heaven. Now, the ironies here are even more comically extravagant than those, I think, of Irving's thought experiment, but both rely on techniques of Swiftian satire. Irony in this argument, and allegory in the one that Todd shared with you. So by ironic inversion in both cases, Irving is arguing for recognizing Indians as people who deserve to live, even though the allegory goes further to suggest that treating Indians with the same mercy and goodwill that Americans would want for themselves is kind of a good idea. That is, now that Europeans have done the dirty deed, Americans would be lunatics that they would be lunatics to proceed against them. So here I want to point out that both irony and allegory join the learned vocabulary and syntax of this passage here to set Irving's anti-imperialist humor in the genteel British tradition of wit. Irving's argument against expansion draws its techniques from prior US colonial ties with England. And I think that's worth thinking about, Todd, that he's using this imperial heritage of humor to counteract imperialism in North America. So I want to urge Todd to think about this and urge him to think more broadly about the formal and rhetorical devices along with theme and phrasing, which is where you are right now, to think about Irving as an American counterpart to Addison and Steele. And here I'm building on Jim Carone's argument about Fanny Fern. I think also you might want to look at works by Elizabeth Funk, and I can share them with you, who's written about the linguistic and cultural heritage of New Netherland in Irving's writings as another dimension of imperial continuity in his work. I think that exploring Irving's rhetorical affinities with European hegemons exposes differences between Irving and his imaginative parallels of witty anti-imperialism and Davy Crockett's hyperbolic advocacy of manifest destiny in the tradition of vernacular humor. So Irving's Crockett's 1847 Almanac exposes the way that vernacular tradition distances both British and American English of a more learned sort, right? In vocabulary, pronunciation, metaphor, syntax, and detail, Crockett's broad Western dialect flaunts his diversion from British gentility, even as he presents himself visually as akin to wild animals. And I wanted you to see all of the different ways in which he is at one with wild animals. He's a master of natural environments like Niagara Falls. He goes over Niagara Falls on a bear. And of course, he is himself a force of nature like lightning. He is a locomotive as well as a weapon. But presenting himself as an authentic American creature who is of the land as well as master of it enables Crockett to justify his claims to further territory. That is, he moves vernacular humor from anti-British imperialism into something that becomes neo-imperialist in Connecticut Yankee and neo-colonialist in the American context. And that is in specific contradistinction elsewhere in the almanac with John Bull. And you mentioned the John Bull, but you can see that the vernacular metaphorical contradistinction between British and American English is also manifest in the illustrations as a contest with John Bull, who is, of course, the manifestation of England. But he not only sets himself against John Bull, and I think it's interesting here, he also sets himself against both red and black Americans. In one of these cases, he's going to boil a red man as a meal, and then here he's gouging the eyes out of a black man. And so he is justifying U.S. domination against both the indigenous inhabitants and the imported subaltern population. This is pretty strong stuff, and I think it merits thinking about the post-colonial posture of Americanist that Crockett projects, justifying U.S. imperial ambitions in North America and against the two subaltern populations within. So moving right on here, then I want to turn to Chander's paper. And I want to begin by appreciating how you articulate the internal contradictions that make Pudd'nhead Wilson such a challenging yet moving book. Sympathy for Black Americans' victimization by a racist slave system that nests within a murder and fingerprinting plot that upholds white supremacy in what Sam calls law and custom. Chander rightly probes, I think, the role of race in this nature-nurture debate that's played out in the novel as biological identity versus law and culture. But I'm really not persuaded that either memory theory or the textual and biographical details that you bring out really support this idea that the novel channels a kind of fondness for white supremacy. That's because I think a kind of literalist reading here ignores the role of irony in the novel, and that irony is present at both the sentence level, at the level of plot, and in theme. And I think we can also see a predecessor for this kind of problem, an ironic problem, in the many fictional twins and lookalikes throughout Mark Twain's writings, where the twins have opposite personalities, opposite politics, and opposite tastes, including, one fighting for the North and one fighting for the South while sharing the same body. Also, as a parallel to this at a more formalist level, we can see in Connecticut Yankee and Huckleberry Finn and other novels, Mark Twain's pattern of creating a series of comic incidents that are followed by a parallel series of serious or tragic incidents or incidents with tragic outcomes. So again, we have this duality as a part of the way in which Mark Twain developed his writings and also themes within them. And I, just turning specifically in Pudd'nhead Wilson, irony marks the narration from the very first joke, where David Wilson gets his reputation as a pudd'nhead by saying that he wished he owned half that dog, whose yelp and snarl and howl have annoyed him, so he wants to kill the dog, to the very end, which ultimately fulfills Roxana's fear of her son being sold down the river, because everybody, quote, granted that to shut up a valuable slave for life would compound the injury caused by the erroneous inventory that deprived Tom Shaber's lawful owners of both his labor and his property value at sale. So, but both of these jokes hinge on the absurd literalism with which the smug folks of Dawson's Landing approach their world. That is, there's kind of an object lesson in the novel that literalism is the problem of Dawson's Landing. The local folks can't see through Wilson's irony to get the joke that he just wants to kill the dog, and they can't see the flaw in a legal system that suddenly transforms a member of elite society into property. So as much as Tom's fate, this blindness in Dawson's Landing seems to me the tragedy of the novel, which means that I can't read Roxy's description of her master as a fairly humane man towards slaves and other animals without inferring implicit criticism of equating slaves with animals. And so I really do resist this foundational claim that Mark Twain invites trouble by presenting the white class as decent and generous. And I'll point out that that kind of remark in Pudd'nhead Wilson is really of a piece with many ironies we see in Huckleberry Finn. For example, in the beginning of Huck Finn, they, quote, fetched the niggers in, fetching them like animals, or Huck's at the very end responding to Aunt Sally's question, anybody hurt? He says, no ma'am, killed a nigger. These are two examples of irony there as well. Nonetheless, I want to take Chander's non-ironic reading very seriously, along with his application of post-colonial theory, because I think they open up a valuable way to think about rhetorical and ideological hybridity rather than conflict in Pudd'nhead Wilson. And specifically, the representation of black and white perspectives. And here I'd like to draw on Homi Bhabha's insight into colonial otherness. The hegemonic forces of imperialism promote stereotypic images of the other in colonial discourse, Bhabha notes, stereotypes that constitute the very bedrock of comic characterization and plot. And we can see that in Pudd'nhead Wilson in the minstrelsy qualities of the narrative. And yet, those stereotypes can also, in Bhabha's view, recast the colonized subject's inside joke from a sign of identity singled out for brutal fun into a relational system of cultural difference. So, the comic hybrids by which African comic traditions of signifying and tricksters moved into American humor in vernacular dialect and subaltern irons mark an American neo-colonial tradition, and is my argument here. A tradition that reflects the colonization of African Americans within hegemonic Anglo-American culture. Such comic hybrids expose, rather than resolve, tensions between assimilation and resistance, with comic clashes of speech, behavior, and values in plots that contest mainstream demands. And so I think we can see both of these rhetorical threads in what Chander sees as warring white and black utopian dreams in Mark Twain's novel. So in this way, the Matters of Empire framework can highlight the hybridity of Pudd'nhead Wilson in terms of its combination of black and white rhetoric as a sign of neo-colonial relations. Mark Twain respectfully constructs the dialect that marks African American characters' cultural identity and uses the signifying by which Roxana and Jasper celebrate their common black rhetorical culture despite her white skin, even as their status as comic figures in the minstrel tradition uphold white supremacist view through the fingerprinting and murder plots. So the oppression of Black Americans that Mark Twain credits to fictions of law and culture is for Baba, or through this Baba lens here, a set of colonial forces that produce and sustain hierarchies of culture and race in Pudd'nhead Wilson. So I'm grateful to Chander for helping me see this side of the novel. But I'd also suggest to you, in working further on this project, to review some recent scholarship that could replace some of what is very dated in Pettit and other sources, including, I think, their incorrect references to Jim and Huckleberry Finn, drawing it from Hemingway rather than from the manuscript. Top of my list would be a 2018 article by Horst Cruz that I think has not got nearly enough attention, reinterpreting the course of composition of Pudd'nhead Wilson based on details of how Clemens completed his draft and then revised the opening after reading the story of Caspar Hauser, a true tale of changelings. Hauser was known as the changeling of Nuremberg. Changelings, nature versus nurture, and a usurped heir. And he read that in 1892 and immediately said, oh, I can see how to finish this novel. Close behind this would be Simon Cole's recent article updating Rogan's analysis of Mark Twain's fingerprint plot in light of new scholarship on Galton's efforts to tie fingerprinting to racial science and eugenics. These articles might also help tie a neo-colonial reading of Pudd'nhead Wilson to its historical, racial, and science fictions. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.